Mr. Syngal, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a very, very dramatic turn of events for telecom in the last few months. And I think given the vantage point you've been at, you were heading things at VSNL. You're often called the father of internet in India. So I'm very glad that you could join us today. I want our conversation to be a bit of history and a bit of current context, because I think that's the best way to understand what happened in telecom. And I want to go back to, the pre-99 period, what some people call Telecom 1.0, when there were huge restrictions on the system, there were hardly any players, very onerous, sort of rules and regulations. Does it look, given the current context, that we are going back to that pre-99 period where a duopoly existed? Does it look like we are headed for duopoly days?
Well, pre-99, well, thank you very much for having me on your show. Well, I can give you a little bit of insight of pre-90s or pre-90. See, pre-90 we were a monopoly. It was only government, government and government. See, the sector started opening up in 92 when the UPA government under Mr. Narasimha Rao came into power, and Sam Pitroda was the chairman of Telecom. Of course, he left in 91, and Mr. Pilot was the telecom minister. So, the opening came with the award of 8 licenses, 2 in each metro city. And Mr. Pilot was very clear that he wouldn't like to give the licenses to the government owned companies, which at that time was MTNL and VSNL. We also applied, by the way, for the metro licenses, but he told us, sorry, tough luck. We partnered with Syngal, and Syngal was very keen that they should have us as Indian partner, but Mr. Pilot said, no, I want private foreign investment. So 8 licenses were awarded sometime in 92, 93, but they again got mired as usual into some legal tangle, etc., and the case went up to Supreme Court, but eventually it got decided, and the metro services started near about August 95, when the first cellular call was made on now defunct the Modi SPICE system from Calcutta to Delhi, and the call was between Jyoti Basu and Pandit Sukhram. I think this was in the month of August 95, and I remember the dates or days because on 14th August 95 we had opened internet. So there were 2 simultaneous, I would say, first to 2 events.
Would you say there were some missteps right at that point in this zeal to attract money, or perhaps the lure of getting very large spectrum auction amounts? Were there some missteps which happened right from that point, Mr. Syngal?
Yes, I think so, because if you look at it in the hindsight, what happened was that the government was greedy to say, let's get money up front. They wanted to balance their books, which is always the the thought process,
the imperative
behind everything. They said, oh, we are giving you permission, we are opening up the market, so you pay upfront, which was not a very, I would say, a wise thing to do. In addition, you see, the call charges for cellular were prohibitive. If you remember, they were 60 rupees a minute, and then also on top of it, even the recipient of the call had to pay a certain amount. So what was called the call party pay system, which I'm slightly moving ahead, which after a lot of agitation by consumers, that got eliminated. But the 60 rupees a minute was a very, very prohibitive call charge at that time. The reason being, the investments which were being made, nobody found that there is a way to recover money unless the call charges are high. And I think there was a mismatch also of a misunderstanding of creating volumes and lowering tariffs. But everything got predicated because of the very high, what they call a millstone round your neck payment, upfront payment. But just moving ahead, there was a realization that it is a mistake. So, come 1999, when the first NDA government came to power, they took a decision that let us not get into this upfront payment business, and the sector was literally getting folded, and who would have been left then holding the can? BSNL had not BSNL didn't exist. MTNL had no license. The government had decided not to provide the cellular services because it was capital intensive, and they said you should focus more on rural, etc., etc. So, it was the NDA one which had the telecom policy. The 1994 telecom policy, first revision took place in 1999, where they moved away from upfront payment on the basis of the percentage of your revenues. You see, if you look at the genesis of this present malaise of AGR, nobody looked at the AGR calculation at that time, what it would constitute. I mean, it said generically AGR. So, people thought that whatever money comes into the revenue, one should pay license fee on that, and which included even the treasury function, it included some trading, etc., etc. So, when the numbers were small, then nobody bothered. But now the numbers today out of these other functions, which are not really telecom functions, have ballooned so much that this also has become a unproductive payment of license fee to the government. But the good thing was that the decline in the telecom sector, especially for the wireless services, because of the NTP 1999, it opened the floodgates, or I would say that it was a waterfall event in the cellular industry, that the pay as you earn was the scheme, PAYE scheme as we called it, but with a caveat that there should be another player as well. And I remember that I had to go and convince the existing players that listen, there is no harm, we have a head start. So, whosoever comes in now will take about year, 2 years, and we can get our act together to put our house in order, and we would have the so called first mover advantage, having installed the infrastructure and having gotten away, or rather got rid of, the upfront license fee payments, because henceforth we will pay the license fee as we move on, as we earn, which was a very fair deal.
I just want to jump on the timeline a little bit ahead to get to the 2008 era, Mr. Syngal, which I think was, again, as you mentioned, I think a watershed moment of sorts because of everything that went wrong with this entire auctioning drama. Walk us through what happened in that period.
You see, to be very honest about it, if one looks at the 2003, when the limited to unlimited, I have to slightly go back to the 2008, because in 2003, the government converted some of the limited licenses, limited mobility licenses, into full mobility, and there were two companies, Tata Tele and Reliance Com. So, they gave a, I mean, normally we said backdoor entry into mobility, and of course, there was another tag name to it, that this is a service which is meant for jholiwalas, because you see, you could not roam on the CDMA, and you couldn't even roam on Tata Tele and Reliance Com, you couldn't roam abroad. So, it had limitations. But in the beginning, everybody felt, oh, come on, what a nice cheap service they were providing, the monsoon hangama, etc., creating third party interest. Anyway, so that was there. So, At that time, the regulation was very clear that there will be 4 players, which included 3 private and 1 government, and there will be 2 CDMA players. So, there will be 6 mobility players in the marketplace. And in case you want to introduce a 5th player or a 6th player, depending upon the availability of the spectrum, these spectrum should be auctioned. On the same lines as it was done in 2001 in a ascending order, which means initially people will apply and then they will bid, and then the upper 2 will be selected or 3 will be selected, and there could be 3-4 rounds. And if I remember correctly, that quite a few licenses were won by Airtel, Idea, and other company, Airtel, Idea, and 1 or 2 other companies. So, it was a very transparent way of auctioning the spectrum, and it was very clearly enshrined in the 2003 recommendation that any future spectrum allocation will have to be on a auction basis, a transparent auction basis. Now, somewhere in 2005, they tweaked the license condition, which said anybody can get a license and you get spectrum when available. So, you can start telecom service under the Indian Telegraph Act 1885 as modified from time to time, but without spectrum. Now, who would venture into digging roads at that stage and hope that spectrum will be available one day? So, that was a tweak which happened in 2005. As a result of that, the then minister, which was I think Mr. Dayanidhi Maran, they started issuing licenses, and early 2007 they issued licenses and said, oh, we will have enough spectrum for these many, and therefore, we will give licenses to them. There was a bit of a malafide. So, therefore, in 2007 they gave some 15-20 licenses, but then the secretary at that time was a person, Mr. Mathur. He was a little bit of risk averse type, and he said, no, doesn't sound good. So, he said, let us refer it to TRAI. So, he referred it to TRAI in the March 2007 that please decide what should we be doing. And then there was a consultation process. I participated in that consultation process. And the consultation process, except 1 or 2 players like Vodafone, they said no auction. Everybody said auction. But it got flawed also because of the combination of technology, which means give spectrum, 2GSM spectrum to some of the CDMA players. I mean, it was everything was getting stage managed, you see, with some
bigger motive in play.
That's right, yeah. So, the recommendation which came out in 2007, August 2007, when Mr. Mishra, who rose to be whatever, was flawed, completely flawed. He gave a recommendation, you auction all spectrum, but not 2G. And somewhere embedded in that recommendation was, if the demand exceeds supply, come back to us and we will tell you what to do. Now, nobody read that part. Everybody said, convenience, forget it, change the cutoff date from 1st October to 25th September. So, all those who are in, which were favorites of the powers that be, by companies by the name of Swan, Cheetah, etc., they were all in, and those who were interested were all out. So, suddenly the cutoff date was 25th and they got spectrum allocation. That is the start of the 2G scam. that really is the start of 2G scam.
Would you say, in a sense, it was also the start of the downfall of the industry in terms of the amount of job losses that would then start staggering off and the financial pressures that then really started kicking in?
That's right. You see, the point is that when it is clearly written, demand or no demand, that whenever you have a fifth player to be brought into the system as a competition, thou shall auction the spectrum, is very clearly written. The reason is that that's a mantra that every day I look at it and said, come on, how could somebody say, no, I am not going to auction the spectrum? How can you tweak some licensing condition to say, okay, take a license, spectrum will be available when available. So that was the beginning of the end of the cell industry. People made money on the side. The money which should have gone into the sector went elsewhere. I mean, there are debates on this, that so what? But people don't understand that if I pay, let's example you to say, you sold your equity, here is the money. What will you do with that money? You might say, okay, let me go and buy a yacht. Because you sold your equity, you got a license.
You're free to do as you please.
You are free to do what you want to do. Compared to, you put the money into the company and then the investors would ask you that I am now watching over you and I want to ensure that my money is spent for the purpose for which I have invested. They are saying, what difference does it make where the money goes? The question is that it is the end use of the money. I call it a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
It's a zero-sum game. It's the end use of the money. In one case, you invest in a yacht or a chateau somewhere. In the other case, you put into the money to grow the business, into the company to grow the business. See, that is not what happened. What was the result? I have also appeared in the PAC, which then gave a recommendation that this was a big scam. I have appeared in the PAC of Mr. Dr. Murli Manor Joshi, and they came out with a report that it was a scam. It was a big scam, and it happened. It's so, it's so sad. Here is Prime Minister making a speech before an international audience in December 2007, saying, spectrum is a scarce national resource. Its allocation has to be in a transparent and a market driven price, so that the public, who are the owners of this scarce national resource, receive the money for their good. But within minutes, the minister then, Mr. Raja, says, who cares? I'm going to distribute, and this is what happened. This is where the entire saga of the 2G scam opened up. I think the date was 11th or 12th December.
And it is against this whole sort of sordid battlefield that we see the emergence and the entry of a new player that calls itself Reliance Jio, and then goes towards huge capex and jumps this 2G and 3G debate and launches straight into 4G. What was the context of the industry at that point, Mr. Syngal, and what was happening with some of the players who were still standing, such as Bharti and Idea?
You see, I think if we jump straight into, say, the present day 2017, 2018 scenario when they came, see, there are some
Anomalies.
Serious anomalies. Okay.
If we call it that politely.
Yeah. I think it's the auction of 2012 or 2010. I think 2012, after the licenses got cancelled, etc., etc., and the government auctioned the broadband wireless access spectrum. which was in effect purely meant for, which was not even bought, which was not even bid by Jio. It was fronted by this Himachal futuristic owner, Mr. Nata, who was fronting the Jio for the simple reason because he had a non-compete pact with his brother. So, he fronted and he bought the broadband wireless access, which was not meant for voice, which was only for data, which was only for internet services. So, the day the non-compete between the two brothers happened, Nata sold the spectrum. He was holding the baby to Reliance, the present Jio, and they then got converted the use of that broadband wireless access to be used for voice as well, and they used the LTE technology to use the spectrum for VoIP or Internet Protocol voice technology. And in addition, the spectrum charge for them, because it was sold for data, was only 1%. But when it got converted into the voice spectrum, they are still paying some sort of blended less spectrum charge, usage charge than the others. Yeah. So, it was a repeat of what happened in 2003, limited mobility to full mobility. In this case, it was the backdoor entry from a spectrum which was acquired for data only into voice and at lower spectrum cost into the system. So, they had the benefit of getting the spectrum at lower cost, and of course, along the way they acquired spectrum, but majority of the spectrum which came to them was through the broadband wireless access spectrum. And then of course, they took about 4 or 5 years to launch their services. Again they got a tailwind because the regulator gave them any amount to say experimental.
Rather conveniently.
Yes. Why? Consumer interest. Where does the consumer interest come? You see, the regulator also has 3 very fundamental, should we say, imperatives or obligations, or he has to look after the consumer. Okay. So, he goes under the consumer banner to say consumer interest. He is the custodian of the health of the industry. Now, if this has caused damage to the industry, why was this done? Why was this done? And third, of course, is the custodian of tariffs, etc., but which again,
got layered into the main question.
Yeah. So, the point I am trying to make is that to say that the government also has not been a spoiled sport, they have also been a spoiled sport. The regulator has not been a spoiled sport, the regulator also has been a spoiled sport. The government regulated in the case of spectrum charge said, charge the same as with the others. But the government in its own wisdom decided, no. So, they are paying some blended charge, the others are paying excessive charge. Well, there is a case by COI, but it will go on and on and on, God knows how long. It will never get decided, but the industry is suffering. So, the point is, you see, the present state of the industry has more to do. In fact, I have another article which I have written is it debt or indebtedness of the industry or the regulatory infirmities? See, there are bad decisions, bad business decisions, which have also caused harm to the industry. Yeah. There have been regulatory infirmities, and the government can't just shut their eyes and say eyes wide open and say no, everything is fine, and you have these band-aid fixes to be taken care of the industry to improve the health of the industry. I mean, it's treating some terminal disease with a headache pill, you see. That's not.
I
That's no
am going
approach.
to come to some of those business irregularities as well, Mr. Singhal, but I want to come back to the core question, or really the fear that people are dealing with now looking at the industry. A, how likely do you think a duopoly is at this stage in time? And B, do you think that even makes sense for the government? Because I don't think a duopoly would make revenue sense for a government that would then lose the juice out of this entire spectrum auction, or the dues that frankly stand right now with Vodafone Idea. Do you think it's looking like a duopoly, and do you think the government will let it happen?
You see, if the government doesn't take or doesn't make a course correction of the like of NTP 1999, then we are in for a serious problem of getting into a duopoly situation. If you see the trend now, all three have said, let's increase the tariffs. Yeah. So it's not the duo which is saying, it's also the geo which is also saying, because they also realize that if they don't increase the tariffs, their viability, I mean, they also are heavily leveraged, but then they have a big balance sheet, they are deeper pockets, and they can do some financial engineering, like saying, okay, pay me 3,000 rupees, which I'll return after n number of years, so which is interest free, which goes into their coffers, you get 30,000 crores. So there are smart things to do, and where BSNL doesn't seem to be doing anything. They are not, I mean, nowhere giving any competition or take care if there is a duopoly, and then they will be decimated. So we will have a private sector duopoly or maybe triopoly.
How did you read the Vodafone chairman's comments saying we are not going to infuse any more capital into this joint venture that we have going? Would you say it was looking like a precursor to an announcement saying, look, we're done with this market, we can't handle it anymore?
Well, it appears that way. And why won't Mr. Birla say, okay, you want to go, you go. You are not adding anything. I have this customer base anyway, regardless of you. And if I am getting it at what is it called, car boot sale or basement bargain price, fine. You want to write off your 15 billion, fine. See, I would say that these are I mean, honestly speaking, I don't think that Vodafone have been really smart enough. It's their creation, and they are hiding under the fact that they have spent billions and billions in non-productive expenses, which is paying 11 billion initially, withholding the 3 billion taxes to the government of India, which they should pay up. I'm convinced that they should pay up. And to tell somebody you can't apply retroactively, it has been applied in their own backyard. It's very clear that government can do whatever it wants to do if it is public good. I have quoted this. If you do a Google search, I have written an article on this giving evidence. It was done in the case of Barclays when they wrote off some billions and billions of Brazilian debt. So there is nothing new, and apparently somebody should look at their balance sheet. They are keeping the money in the hope that if you don't pay, it's their good money. So they in their minds they know that this money has to be paid. So why can't they pay up? That is number one. So that was not a very smart move. Then the put option with Ruias. Why should they be paying 5 billion at some price discovery when they bought in 2007? Their third blunder was this cost of surrogacy, which is because they breached the FDI and they had to pay 3 or 4 investors just to make it look as Indian investment. It's not today. It happened even earlier. during the first license as well, when the 74 or 51 was breached, Kotak Mahindra, Kotak Mahindra was holding the baby because they had breached the FDI then as well. So, I think if we go step by step, I think that Vodafone has to blame themselves, and then their very litigationist approach which they have on everything. If you take their CEO who was here, Martin Peters, drop of a hat you go and litigate. The government would say, okay, litigate. We will decide. Now you have gone to the court, we will decide whenever it happens. So, I don't think that by making such statements, he is going to earn any sympathies.
Where does Bharti stand in this entire episode? Because one point of criticism also is that for a long time, some of these telecom players chose to sit on their hands and do nothing in terms of pumping more capital back into a business that genuinely needs it.
I think I go back to my question or my answer or my let us say question to you, that what was the need to invest $7 billion for the African safari? See, it may be, I'm not questioning that you don't have, you as an entrepreneur, you should be looking for opportunities, but then you need to strike a balance whether you can fund that or service that, more elegant word, whether you can service that without straining your own balance sheet here. You see, after all, you are showing consolidated results here and then saying, oh, by the way, I am over leveraged. So, the point is, they have a very good partner, Syngal. They own, I think, at best inside of 40%. So, they have a very strong partner, Syngal, very strong partner. So, in terms of raising money, I would say that today he is the best placed.
That's exactly the point I was coming to, Mr. Syngal, because this entire AGR issue seemed like the last straw on the camel's back, and voices got really loud for the government to come in and intervene. A committee of secretaries was set up. The one key decision that came out was putting a moratorium on this payment.
That's a band-aid.
But now it seems like the committee itself has been disbanded. I mean, so many ideas were put forth, giving GST credits, in lieu of this, removing, as you said, waiving off this this penalty, interest on penalty. Are you hopeful that there will be any solid outcome in terms of the government fixing all the wrongs that have happened?
You see, the government has taken, I have only read the headlines today or a little bit into the details. The government says that this is the Supreme Court decision or verdict, which is supreme, and Supreme Court is busy with many other serious issues, let us say. But let us see what is the outcome of the review petition. I think the review petition is exactly on the lines of what I just mentioned, and I work for a law firm as well. So, I said, look, listen, I have been asked to write this article for a telecom magazine, and let us see if there are loopholes in the entire thing. So, we have quoted from various law cases in the past and precedents that the government can easily say, okay, interest doesn't need to be capitalized. And if you look at it, then this 92,000 crores, if my memory serves right, will reduce to about 28,000 crores. Would you believe that? I mean, it's a huge amount of money. You see, this is, you see, what intrigues me is, it's not a delay. Let us say they are at fault. Let us assume for a minute they are at fault. They didn't pay the AGR. Let us assume that. But if the court takes 14 years, you see, the case started sometimes, it started in 2003, if I remember right. This is what the date which is being mentioned, whatever. Now, if the case lingers on for generations, which happens in the civil suits, why should the uh, uh, who is the
concerned?
yeah why should they suffer? At least, I mean, to me, the logic defies. The logic defies. You see, the delay is in the processes of the government in taking a decision. And by the way, the interesting part is that TD said twice said that the methodology used by DOT is wrong. So, on what basis? And TDSAT is also chaired by a retired Supreme Court judge. So, on what basis the Supreme Court thought that the government is right and everyone else is
Isn't the government
wrong?
also choking a sector that has traditionally been a huge source of revenues for it, Mr. Syngal? I mean, for this financial year already, we are at 40% less than what the government earned in the year before that.
See, it's it's that proverbial that you chop off the
nose to spite the face. Yeah. There have also been murmurs of introducing some kind of a floor pricing mechanism now. A, would you say it's too late? And B, traditionally this floor pricing mechanism actually favors the leader within the market. Do you think that skew might actually come in where this goes against the telecom players instead of for them?
You see, this is again tinkering with, or say, in a way saying, okay, we give you this SOP and you can't go below that. But my view is that, isn't it, I mean, one can argue it either way to say, okay guys, if we don't have a floor price, can you go up? Or if the industry can tolerate a lower tariff, can they go down? See, the best thing is that the government should try to put their house in order, and the regulator as well. The government means all the three, all the parties, and look at the entire problem which is today facing the industry.
In this context, Mr. Syngal, I also want to ask you what you make of this recent decision by the government to merge BSNL and MTNL. There is a VRS scheme announced, but it will stay within the fold of the government. Where does that player fit in the current context?
You see, Mitali, I would say that this is not a solution. I had given, I'm not God gift to mankind, okay, but we had given a paper in 2014, or rather even before that, to the previous government. The government is themselves, all the governments have to be blamed for the inactions. All governments. I won't say it's UPA creation, I won't say it's NDA creation, I won't say all the government. You see, you got to be truthful to the investors as to what are you going to do with the money which you are collecting from them. BSNL, MTNL, no point, MTNL was in any case divested into the market, is a tradable commodity. But where was the governance? Zilch. BSNL, just by making a corporation, what do? You have some joint secretary, additional secretary running these companies. The disaster with BSNL started when both industry and one additional secretary from the ministry shot down their procurement of 94 million lines of cellular business. They had the best infrastructure in the case of the rural coverage, etc., etc. I have personally experienced, you go out of the city, there is no private coverage, but you go into rural areas, you had BSNL coverage. They had the best possible network. Now, the folly of BSNL, we will not allow anybody to roam on our network. But this is Tughlaq mentality, sorry, using this.
Finally, Mr. Syngal, there is an overhang in the system. Judicial pronouncements are still awaited, regulatory overhang remains. Are you hopeful that this sector can turn the number of wrong, left turns it's taken? Or do you think it's going to just continue to bumble along like this, with perhaps one player continuing to tower over the others and the others scrambling to stay afloat?
You see, I think that if the government has the will, they can certainly turn around the sector. They can certainly turn around that. I think the government must not mess around with this sector anymore. And the actions to be taken are not band-aid solutions. For the private sector, I don't hold any brief for any one of them, but they have also made mistakes. So, first of all, let them admit, yes, they made mistakes. Let them go humbly to say that, like what was done in 99, let's take some positive, proactive steps like reclassification of AGR plus waiving of some of the penalties and interest charges, which are not entirely their fault, but also the fault of the system we have in the country. So, that is the private sector part, which perhaps can revive the private sector. But in terms of revival of BSNL on MTNL, again this VRS and all is band-aid. Whose money is this? Taxpayers' money. Why can't they monetize the assets? They should have done it in 2003 when BSNL was valued at something like 35-40 billion dollars. So, even if that's then offloaded 10%, $4 billion are nowhere, and that money they could easily have spent then about 15 years back in retiring the extra fat which they have, which they are doing today at the taxpayers' cost. You see, I am a firm believer that because of lack of awareness, people are forgetting, or the government is forgetting, that on one side it is the taxpayers' money, on the other side is the savers' money. The savers' money is being used to fund the private sector, okay, and the taxpayers' money, they say, is being used for BSNL. Nobody is saying that. You monetize the assets. It's done world over. It's done world over. British Telecom was done in 84. So, there are steps, 2 or 3 simple steps if the government takes. They can bring in competition, they can bring in some semblance of shades of pink into the sector back again. But if they continue like this, tough luck.
We can only live in hope. Thank you very much, Mr. Syngal, for your time today. Thank you. It was a fascinating conversation.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.